Hi, this review is going to compare the video game Anima Gate of Memories with the tabletop role-playing game Anima Beyond Fantasy. Probably a lot of you know that Anima Gate of Memories is based on the tabletop role-playing game of that same universe. However, this review is not going to contain footage of the game. You won't see graphics and sound and all of that, or video clips of the gameplay. There are other reviews here on YouTube that will do a much better job at communicating that and showing you aspects of the gameplay, sounds, graphics. I will talk about those things here, but this review is going to be more bare bones, mostly focused on comparing it with the tabletop RPG experience. It's going to be similar to my review of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. I'm going to put a link in the description below to that review if you haven't seen it. And I'm also going to put a link to the trailer of Anima Gate of Memories for those of you that do not know anything about Anima Gate of Memories. And for those of you that are curious about my next RPG review, I'll try to bring it out next week. It's a very complex, in fact, multi-genre type of steampunk sort of RPG. So I hope you will watch that one. It's a somewhat large book, 400 and something pages. It's not as complex as my review of Fight 2nd Edition. That's also a thick tome, but that system is much more complex. If you haven't seen my review of Fight 2nd Edition, the link will be in the description below as well. So let's get started with Anima Gate of Memories. Let's talk about the graphics first. And let me give you a brief overview of Anima Beyond Fantasy. I'm also going to put a link in the description to my old review of the core rulebook. I actually would like to do another review to improve many things when it comes to my expressing my opinions of the tabletop role-playing game and the core rulebook, of course. But if you want to watch that old review, it's going to be in the description. But for those of you that do not know what Anima is, it's basically, many people say that it's the closest thing when it comes to a Final Fantasy tabletop RPG, because it has so many over-the-top elements. You also have that conflict with protecting the planet, fighting religion at times, although you can be a member of the different cults in Anima Beyond Fantasy. It's a game heavily inspired in both Christianity and paganism. You even have a non-player character, an important non-player character there that it's basically like a copy of Jesus, but it's the Anima Beyond Fantasy version. And you do have a church that is ruling with an iron fist, and you have these conflicts with a more pagan sort of factions. So there are many opportunities for adventures in the tabletop role-playing game of Anima Beyond Fantasy, and the characters become just too powerful, to the point that a single character could destroy an entire city or armies, especially with the spells that you can develop later on. So it's a very high fantasy, over the top sort of experience. So when it comes to the graphics, I think they do a really good job, even though they are not the best graphics that you will see in a computer game. In fact, with a low performance PC, it is possible to play that video game. But when it comes to the design, the way that they paint the world, I think that it's almost perfect. My only complaint is that a few of the zones and areas, at times they feel a bit bland. They could have added more details. And another thing is that some areas are just too dark, and I don't mean that they are dark as creepy or something. I mean that it's very difficult to see your way through. There is this sort of mansion, and the corridors and hallways get too dark, and there are some nice details in that stage, like books and paintings, and because of the darkness it's very difficult to appreciate those details. So I think they could have done a better job when it comes to illumination. But in general, the graphics really pull you into the world of Anima Beyond Fantasy. It's a very over the top, ethereal almost version of of your typical fantasy world. There's a conflict between demons and gods, and the inhabitants, the normal humans and elf-like beings that become almost as powerful as the gods themselves, although it is a setting somewhat of decadence. Like many epic stories, like for example the Lord of the Rings, sometimes you see that background history of the setting where there were in the past these beings so powerful that they could take on many seemingly impossible to defeat enemies at the same time, and now in current times within the fictional setting, it feels like if a single one of those godlike beings threatened the world, the inhabitants of current times, they will have an almost impossible time, or it will be almost too difficult for them to defeat those beings. So in Anima Beyond Fantasy, you could say that there is a slight hint of eschatological narrative that, oh no, there are these demons and gods, and if those beings somehow escape from their prisons, or if they come into our plane of existence, or if they regain their lost power or something like that, it's going to be almost impossible to defeat them. So with the Anima Gate of Memories video game, you see all of these huge cathedral type of areas and these waterfalls, mountains, and these almost endless fields and prairies, and sometimes things become quite multi-dimensional with floating platforms and mist and fog and just those skies or spaces that seem to go endlessly. You never know if there's actually an end to some areas. You cannot move through all of the different stages and worlds, but you still get a glimpse of things that are far away, and you kind of get excited, or you kind of wish that you could go farther into those stages. So I think that's a really good mark of a good game, of a good video game, when it comes to designing the levels, where you want to explore even more beyond the limits of the video game. And so I think the graphics do a really good job when it comes to the world building. You see this, and the buildings, they are just so tall. You see this, like I told you, the cathedral type of areas, and the walls go up, and you do not see the end. You cannot see the roof area of the building. Some areas are also very creepy, very mysterious. There is this level, because there are pocket dimensions in this game, where it's a sort of like a creepy a Halloweeny Jack the Ripper sort of level, because it feels like a combination of what you would expect to see in a scary level, but also you have a sewer system like those that Jack the Ripper would use to move through the underground London. So I think the graphics do a terrific job when it comes to the world itself and the stages. Sometimes they also become quite creative when it comes to handling different angles or perspectives as your character is moving through the different stages. That is, this is a 3D sort of action RPG, but sometimes they give you like a side scroller type of section of a single stage. So those changes are quite interesting, although I do not like it when they sometimes fix the camera at a very awkward angle. It's very difficult for you to move through jumping from platform to platform. There are some platform sections, so I think they sacrifice too much when it comes to gameplay just to give you an interesting angle of that same stage or zone. I think they should have kept things a bit more simple. That is, they show you the 3D world without trying to play around with the perspective. I think they could have done otherwise if they had tighter controls, but when I talk about gameplay, you will see that it was a hindrance. Now, when it comes to the character designs, they also look great. Both the character designs and in the world, they look like the illustrations that you see in the core rulebook of Anima Beyond Fantasy. That core rulebook contains some of the best fantasy art that I have seen in high fantasy RPGs. It's probably competing for the first place with Great Sword. If you do not know what the Great Sword role-playing game is, I'm also going to put a link in the description, because the art there is so amazing, so flawless. I think that perhaps I think that the art in Great Sword surpasses Anima Beyond Fantasy, but that's just my personal preference. I'll let you decide. And now let's talk about the music and voice acting. Well, the music is probably one of my favorite aspects of the game. You have this epic soundtrack, these different tracks for battles that they represent that over the top, almost anime type of fighting or JRPG sort of battles. So they really get you psyched or pumped up to fight. But my favorite parts of the soundtrack are those that have that sort of angelic choir sort of sound to them. It sounds like music that you would expect to find in a temple. So it sounds sometimes hopeful, tranquil, but at the same time sad, and suddenly it shifts to a more dangerous or ominous sort of sound. And it makes sense, because when I talk about the story, and this is going to be spoiler free, I'm just going to give you like the basic premise. There is some sort of apocalypse going on. So you see this almost opera type of sounds with dun, da, 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 da. And then it goes really down like dun, dun, like it sounds so beautiful, but it's also there's something really deadly and apocalyptic going on. So the music is so beautiful. I'm going to put a link to a couple of those tracks in the description. Now, when it comes to voice acting, and I will talk a bit more about this when I talk about the story of the game, I think that in general they do a good job, but some lines could have been delivered better. And I think that there is sometimes a lack of consistency when it comes to the personality of the character and the way that the lines are delivered, and the dialogue that sometimes the character says some things that do not go with that character's personality, in my opinion. Now, before we talk about the gameplay, because there are actually some links between the gameplay and the tabletop role-playing game, I want to talk about the plotline. And just to close up with the graphics and sound, I think they managed to represent the world of the tabletop RPG experience of Anima Beyond Fantasy. Perhaps the only thing that I do not like, and you can actually see some of the illustrations of the core rulebook in some screens of the game, but there are some character designs that have this huge nose. It kind of looks like a huge drop of water, and that nose, I'm not particularly a fan of that sort of nose. Like, it looks like a huge drop. So that's I would consider that a negative, but maybe it's just a personal preference of mine. Now, when it comes to the story is actually quite interesting. You could basically take the plot of this video game, and if your players do not plan to play Anima Gate of Memories, because it would spoil things for them, you could build an entire campaign with the story of Gate of Memories. You play as two characters. You're constantly switching between the characters because you basically play as some wizard sort of character that has a demon trapped in a grimoire. The wizard or spellcaster sort of character is the bearer of calamities. She's this very she's not that young. She's a young girl, probably in her late teenage years, but she has this incredibly powerful demon known as Ergo Mundus trapped in a grimoire. They do not tell you how that happened, how such a young girl and perhaps not as experienced as other spellcasters managed to take control of this demon. It's part of the mystery. As you play the story, you will see the past of the bearer of calamities and Ergo Mundus, and it will all make sense. And it's such a um, mm, complex character in that at the same time she's so powerful, but then again she seems quite naive or quite uninformed as to what is going on. She's not as knowledgeable as other characters. I think I would have preferred it if she had a bit more knowledge about what is going on, because sometimes it's a bit exasperating that she's using these powerful spells and attacks. She seems so capable, and she has Ergo Mundus under her control, and she orders him around. But suddenly she's asking like very basic questions about the plot, about the story, about the world. I would, yeah, it doesn't make too much sense that she's actually able to control Ergo, and at the same time she seems so naive. Now, when it comes to the voice actress that speaks her dialogues, it happens in the same way, but I think it is intentional. Sometimes she's telling the player what is going on through different fragments of memories. This is related to the Gate of Memories title of the game. Sometimes you are moving through different pocket dimensions and you find these fragments of some non-player characters that you have to defeat. They are actually quite interesting when it comes to the life of the different player characters. I will talk more about that later on. But she's telling you this story, and she seems so knowledgeable. At times she also seems to know a lot about the way things are developing, but suddenly she asks some very basic questions. Maybe it's because of her programming by the part of the church, because she's actually a member of the church. So maybe they have her under some sort of like hypnosis, constantly droning the dogmas and doctrines of the church. So she's sometimes she feels a bit almost mind controlled to fanatic. Mm. But the voice actress really delivers good dialogues, but sometimes she sounds like she has bread or something stuck in her mouth. She's sometimes speaking like this, kind of like the Godfather, in the movies. So I think she fails a bit at that, but the rest of the lines are great when she delivers them. And you kind of feel a bit bad about the bearer of calamities, because she seems to be surrounded by some sort of taboo or stigma that she controls this insanely powerful demon Ergo Mundus, because Ergo Mundus, this guy almost brought destruction to the probably entire universe of Anima, and only through many sacrifices, entire armies that died fighting him, and only through trickery and deception were they able to capture Ergo Mundus. But he's like one of the major apocalyptic powers of Anima Beyond Fantasy. So Bearer of Calamities, it's obvious that many probably fear her, and she lost all of her memories because, as part of some sort of agreement or contract with the demon, she just tossed away all of her memories. She does not know even her own name, and Ergo Mundus actually has her memories, and sometimes he teases her about her past. So if Ergo Mundus wanted to, he could probably reveal all of her past to her, but he is a demon, so there's not much incentive for him to do that. He's having a lot more fun torturing her like that. The relationship between Ergo Mundus and the Bearer of Calamities is quite interesting. You are never certain until the very end of the game. You are not very certain as to what sort of connection they have. Now, when it comes to Ergo Mundus, he's slightly disappointing to me, because sometimes he does feel like this demon that is probably thousands, if not millions of years old. But he has sometimes this very adolescent type of behavior. And the voice actor sometimes sounds really cool, like someone a bit insane, that is sometimes very knowledgeable and serious, and sometimes he makes jokes, but there is this part where Ergomundus is just singing to pass the time, and he sounds so ridiculous. I wouldn't expect that from such a powerful being. Maybe it's part of his complex personality or demonality or whatever you want to call it. But I would have preferred it if there was a bit more consistency. I like the insane genius and sometimes very severe sort of a demonic character that he displays most of the time. But when he breaks out of character, so to speak, with those funny and silly moments, sometimes it even feels a bit cringy. Now, when this game first came out, a lot of those people, those sensitive people, got into this outrage because Ergo Mundus, he's constantly saying, like, how would you say, sleazy or chauvinistic sort of names or insults or remarks to the heroine, to the bearer of calamities. He's constantly calling her baby, although there's actually a reason as to why he's calling her baby, and that's not the worst part. For example, well, and on that perspective, he basically, the bearer of calamities is always carrying the grimoire that is could be considered a part of the body of Ergomundus near her butt. So he's constantly saying, like, "Oh, I'm feeling so. I like it that you're constantly slapping your ass against my body." His Ergo says some of those things. So it's quite mild. However, there is a part where she is unconscious and she wakes up, and Ergo hints that he actually abused her in some way while she was unconscious. So this got a lot of, those guys in an outrage. But I think it's logical because he's supposed to be a demon. What would you expect to happen if you had an unconscious woman near a demon? There are many stories of demons attacking people when they are sleeping and all of that. So it makes sense he is a demon. However, because of different things that happen later on in the game, I kind of get the feeling that he wasn't serious when he said that, because he's constantly saying things about the bearer of calamity's ass and her body and how he wants to defile that body and all of that, getting a bit sleazy. But like I said, there's more to Ergo than meets the eye. It depends, because there's actually there are different endings, and depending on what you do in the game, that is on how you finish the game, there is an ending where things turn out in a certain way when it comes to Ergo's personality, and there are other endings where Ergo shows a different side of him. So I think that's part of the best thing about the game is seeing that strange connection between the bearer of calamities and Ergo Mundus. There are other characters in the game as well. Going back to the main plotline, you have the bearer of calamities. She works for the church. She uses Ergo as her main weapon. That is, usually bring out the book and you whip the book around, like almost like a whip in Castlevania in the 3D games. And you can also switch. You release Ergo from the book, and now you play as Ergo, and the bearer of calamities seems to go into the book herself. I will talk a bit more about that when I talk about the gameplay, because there are some things that were also slightly disappointing. Well, the bearer of calamities was tasked by the church to capture this traitor. She is the Red Lady. She's actually the mentor of the bearer of calamities, and the Red Lady, she's quite hostile, because, well, one would expect a mentor or teacher sort of character to feel a bit reluctant when it comes to fighting her own pupil or her own student, but she actually seems happy that she gets to fight her own student. It almost seems like she's encouraging the fight between them. So the church does not know why the Red Lady betrayed them. I don't want to give too many details to keep this spoiler free, but she's on the run and the bearer of calamities needs to hunt her down. And while they're fighting the Red Lady, this strange character known as Nameless appears, and they have a bit of a fight. it's quite impressive. I think the Nameless had the potential to be one of the coolest characters. However, because of the voice actor, this wasn't so, in my opinion. Nameless looks like your typical silent, mysterious, brooding character. Kind of looks like an elf. He reminds me a bit of Vincent from Final Fantasy VII. You know, he has part of his face covered up, and he's constantly like talking speaking in riddles almost. When he actually speaks, he's quite silent, and when he first appears, Ergo is like, "Oh baby, watch out! This guy is dangerous, very powerful." So even if Ergo Mundus, a character as powerful as him, that is pretty much like a god in Anima Beyond Fantasy, it feels threatened by Nameless. You get interested and you want to know more about Nameless. There's actually another game that shows you the what Nameless experienced when the Bearer of Calamities and Ergo Mundus were fighting in their own adventure. So you want to see like the side of Nameless, you should play that game. I got it as part of a sale, but I haven't played it yet. Been a bit busy, but I want to play it as soon as possible. So while they are fighting Nameless, they get drawn into this sort of pocket dimension, a sort of tower, a dimensional hub, you could say. And it is within that place where they contact Romeo Exet, who is still on the material plane, let's say. You seem to be like in a sort of ethereal or astral sort of plane. And Romeo Exet, that is the head of the church and the Inquisition at the same time, because in the past you usually have two separate chiefs or bosses that one controls the church and the other the Inquisition, but he actually managed to take control of both the Inquisition and the church, and he tasks the Bearer of Calamities with a new mission. He put aside the thing about the Red Lady for the moment. It has to do with some events that happen in the game, and he tells the Bearer of Calamities that she must stop this apocalyptic this prophecy, because within this dimensional fortress, so to speak, the Bearer of Calamities also encounters Alienai. She is one of the most powerful, or she was one of the most powerful spellcasters or miracle makers, the church would prefer to call her, in the world universe of Anima Beyond Fantasy. She basically sacrificed her life to save the world in the past. She actually was the one who deceived Ergo Mundus to trap him in the grimoire. So Alienai, I think that she's also a bit disappointing because her personality seems like a bit too immature. When she first encounters the Bearer of Calamities, well, she does not trust Alienai. She does not know that she is the Alienai from myth and legend, and Alienai has a sort of attitude of, "Don't you know who I am?" So it sounds really immature. That is, if you're really powerful, you do not care if they recognize that of you when it comes to fulfilling an important objective. A more appropriate attitude on her part would have been, "Well, you can think whatever you like about me. I just want to warn you because this is what's going on." She's actually in this sort of spirit form. Like I told you, she sacrificed her life, and she's more like a Force ghost from Star Wars. She's kind of like floating there or appearing there, and she can offer guidance and some subtle help at times, but she does not have too much ability when it comes to affecting the world outside of her own spiritual plane. So I think it's also going to be interesting to see the past of Ergo and Alienai, because they know each other, and it's a good thing that Ergo immediately verified that Alienai was the Alienai from myth and legend, because like I told you, that dialogue between the Bearer of Calamities and Alienai, it feels too immature in my opinion. So based on what Alienai tells the player character, the Bearer of Calamities, and based on the information that Romeo and the orders that Romeo Exet gives you, you discover that there are beings, if I remember correctly, they are referred to as messengers, trapped within that sort of pocket dimension that I told you. Each one of those is living in their own sub-dimension, a sort of mini universe based around everything that happened in their own personal lives. And it almost feels like you have a sort of Highlander or Immortal sort of situation where each one of them wants to eliminate the others to obtain power over everything, and the one who obtains enough power will become this cataclysm, this apocalypse. So it is up to the bearer of calamities to eliminate those messengers before one of them becomes just too powerful. And when it comes to Romeo Exit, he's quite the jerk. He's what would you expect of someone who is the chief of the church and the Inquisition? He doesn't care about the bearer of calamities. He's constantly giving her orders. The bearer of calamities, while she's fighting those messengers and while she is defeating them, she's going to experience changes in her bodies and memories. Her own memories will start to return despite her contract with Ergo. And she's quite afraid. Like I told you, she's a young girl, and she expresses her concern to Romeo Exit, who should be like, yes, like a mentor as well. And he's kind of like, well, I don't care, you go and finish your job. The only one that I think that cares a bit is Ellie and I, but that's part of the atmosphere of the game. It feels so, the characters feel so alienated at times. Like there is you really have to look hard for those emotional connections between the different characters. Maybe, and I think that's part of the strong point of the game. Not only finding out about this greater conflict of this sort of apocalypse that could happen if you do not stop those powerful beings, each in their dimensions, but also really figuring out the connections, the emotional connections, the virtuous connections, I would say, between the different characters. Who is your enemy? Who is your friend? Who is more than that? So that's basically the premise of the game. And each of these other enemies, like I told you, like messengers of the apocalypse, it's very interesting to see what happened in their own lives. Each of those sub-dimensions that are kind of like the particular or personal world for each of those messengers, they are tied to the tragedies they experienced in life. You have a world that is sort of like a fairy tale sort of world with a lot of sunlight, with Stonehenge sort of constructions and monoliths. You also have, like I told you, a world that is very creepy, filled with all of those tombstones, kind of like that German cemetery. You know, like that Jewish cemetery in Germany, where you have all of those tombstones piled on top of each other. And those, like I told you, like London sewer sort of section. There's also a world that feels quite ancient with many temples, like Sumerian looking temples and such. But that's just to give you like an idea, because the cultures they do not reference a specific culture. They are quite over the top, high fantasy with no real world ties. So there's a good variety when it comes to the dimensions that you can explore. There's also another one that is basically this huge temple and this level that is composed of different seasons. Really cool level. That is, some areas are really snowy and cold. Some other areas represent autumn and spring and summer. And so there's a really good variety. You never feel bored that it's always the same. There is this mansion that I told you that sadly it's a bit too dark, because the paintings look really good, and all of the different messengers, they are so tragic, they are so powerful, but at the same time they lived a very sad existence. And I don't want to give too many details, but you have one that is basically obsessed with art to the point that it becomes an aberration. You have another one that discovers that he is actually not the type of being that he thought he was. He's much more. And there's another messenger that experienced so many deaths and sadness and misery to the point that he ended up he ended up transforming into a being of nightmare. And it's also interesting to see how actually Ergo has a connection with one of the messengers, and so that's part of the charm of the game. An interesting thing that I forgot to mention about in the graphics, and I would expect that because in the tabletop role-playing game you have a lot of reference to, let's say, real-world demons and philosophies, mythologies, and I've noticed that there are a lot of demonic sigils, that is real demonic sigils that you would find in grimoires in real life in the game. So looks kind of weird, but maybe it adds to the authenticity. It's up to you. Now let's move on to the gameplay, because that's basically the story, and that's what I told you, that it's a good framework for a campaign. You could create a campaign where the player characters are members of a faction, maybe the church or some other faction in Anima Beyond Fantasy, and they need to hunt down perhaps their former mentor. Maybe they are all students of that mentor that betrayed their faction or organization, and they end up getting sucked into this pocket world or pocket dimension. And they need to hunt down the messengers. Maybe you want to handle things exactly like the plotline, or maybe you want to change some things. But now let's go to the gameplay. How does the gameplay compare with the tabletop role-playing game? Because the story, as many of you that have played Anima Beyond Fantasy, you can see the story is perfect for that tabletop role-playing game. But when it comes to the gameplay, it's decent, but it does have its failings. First, the main characters. You have the Bearer of Calamities and Ergo Mundus. Ergo Mundus is supposed to be so powerful, but I always felt like the Bearer of Calamities is much more useful than him in combat. Her basic attack, like I told you, she's using like the grimoire that holds Ergo inside. She uses it like a sort of telekinetic whip, moving it around. It's such a useful weapon, but when Ergo attacks, he just does this like very close quarters sort of slash with his claws. He has a human form, but he has some demonic aspects to him, and his attacks do not feel as useful. You need to be really up close to the enemy. Sometimes you miss a lot. If only they added a bit more hitbox, maybe they would have been more useful. But I always wanted to switch to the Bearer of Calamities. And also when it comes to the spells and abilities, you also have these things that boost Ergo's damage, his capacity to deal damage, and sometimes his defense, if I remember correctly, and his ability to drain health. But the Bearer of Calamities also has a spell that regenerates her health, and her spells and excellent basic attack makes up for anything that Ergo already has. So it's so disappointing, because I wanted to feel like I was really powerful when I played as Ergo, but and the Bearer of Calamities felt more useful in general. Now when it comes to the combat system, funny enough, it does feel like the tabletop role-playing game in the sense that when you are hit, you get pushed back too far. In the tabletop role-playing game, you do not get pushed back, but there is a chance of getting you stun locked. That is, if they start to hit you, they sometimes make you lose your turn to act. And in Anima Gate of Memories, you experience that in a frustrating way, because almost all of the attacks that hit you send your character flying so many meters behind. They just push you back so far, so you feel too flimsy. In other games like let's say Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden, when you get hit, if it's a really strong attack, yes, they're going to send you flying back, but some more subtle attacks, they just stun you a bit. But in Anima Beyond Fantasy, almost all of the attacks send you flying backwards, and you can even get into a sort of death spiral or death combo if they start hitting you with so many things, and you can't do anything but helplessly wait for your character to recover from all of those hits. So combat can get quite frustrating. There are some cool aspects to combat, like for example, both the Bearer of Calamities and Ergo Mundus have this sort of attack where they hover towards their enemies. It looks a bit like, for example, in Fate Zero when Kirei fights. Oh, sorry, I forgot the Kiritsugu fights Kirei, and the Kirei moves towards. Well, they move in a similar fashion, like they hover while they are moving forward. I'm going to put a link in the description to that fight. And so in those moments, the combat is quite cool, but there are some other moves that you will never use. They are just there, and they are not useful at all. For example, you have an attack that you basically hit your opponent into the air and you jump with that opponent to do a sort of air combo, but it's quite pointless. It's not as useful as many other more direct attacks. It's just there to show off, and I almost never used it. Sometimes, but almost rarely. It's not as useful as the other moves. There's also some spells that are really cool. I really like them in how they express the over the top powers of tabletop role playing game. The Bearer of Calamities basically creates this sort of like supernova sort of attack. And she says something like, "You are now just a memory" or something. Like she's going to obliterate the enemies, and you keep using those attacks constantly because when you go up in levels, your mana or your magic regenerates so fast, so you can constantly spam those attacks. It's not going to make you impossible to defeat, but when it comes to fighting normal enemies, you do feel so powerful. Although there are some enemies that are also quite frustrating because they deal so much damage. They attack from afar like snipers. Sometimes they have these invincible states. They have this sort of shield or force field around them, and your attacks do not affect them unless you have an attack with a special guard break property. And like I told you, Ergos has some cool spells, but they do not. I did not like them as much as the spells of the Bearer of Calamities, and even his attacks that should be more physical, more key based, because you have magic and key. When you use spells, your magic meter goes down and regenerates as a bit slowly at first, but in higher levels it regenerates faster. And when it comes to key is used for dodging and using key based attacks. Usually I think that if you're dodging a lot, and you will be dodging a lot because the attacks happen so fast, your key goes down so rapidly, so ergo is at a disadvantage in my opinion, because you're going to be dodging and your key is going to go down, and many of Ergo's attacks are based on key, so you're constantly feeling low on key. And even Ergo's most powerful attack, he's basically throwing this barrage of slashes or with his claw-like hands, because the enemies send you tumbling back so easily. Sometimes you're almost doing this combo and you get pushed around and you lose that combo, especially against the bosses. There are only some very small moments in the boss fights where you can actually do some sort of combo, very different from, for example, Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden, that you have these moments, let's say that you attack the boss and hit him in a sort of weak spot or during a particular frame and you have a lot of time to do all sorts of cool combos against that boss. And in Anima Gate of Memories, it never felt as satisfying like that. It always felt like you could only do a few attacks before you had to revert to your dodging and jumping and moving about so that the boss doesn't hit you and send you flying who knows how many meters back. So combat could have been improved, definitely. There are also some frustrating platform sections. You have to move from those moving platforms, sort of like Mario Bros. Well, for a better comparison, you could say it feels a bit like a more improved version of Castlevania 64. I like the other game more, the one where you play as the werewolf. What was it called? Something about darkness. Well, the other Castlevania 64 game, it reminds me of those platforming sections, but in Anima Beyond Fantasy, like I told you, the platform is not as solid. The mechanics to jump from platform to platform. Sometimes you have this platform over here and your character is standing here in this other platform, and you jump and you feel like there is some sort of magnet that sometimes makes you slip down from the platform. it depends. So it feels quite erratic. In some cases, you do feel like you're jumping from platform to platform in a very agile way, and in other cases, it feels somewhat slippery. And there are some frustrating moments. Like for example, there is this fight with this huge rock, like a floating rock, and it's shooting beams or rays at you. And you have these floating platforms that form a sort of circular stairway towards that rock, and you need to jump from platform to platform, avoiding those rays or beams of light from dropping you. Because if you fall down, you need to climb all the way back. They do not let you to restart at the same platform from which you fell. So once you actually manage to get to that floating rock, you get to hit it a few times, and then you get pushed back again, and you have to climb up again, jumping from platform to platform. So that really gets frustrating. I definitely recommend you play this game with a controller, not with the keyboard. Mm. And there is a disconnection between that over-the-top aspect of Anima Beyond Fantasy and those platforming sections, because in other moments there are these really heavy blocks and you need to either push them or pull them, and when you do that, the Bearer of Calamities and Ergo, they kind of like hover in place, like suddenly they develop some sort of levitation, and they start to, with their minds, to push and pull those blocks. So you think, why did they need to jump from platform to platform? They could basically fly. Or why weren't they able to pull those platforms towards them with their telekinesis or something, and attack that stone or get from this place to the other? So there is a sort of disconnection. So there are some frustrating aspects when it comes to the gameplay. Could have been better implemented or improved, and like I told you, sometimes they change the perspective. Sometimes it looks like a side scroller instead of your typical 3D action platformer RPG. And other times, like I told you, they fix the camera angle and the controls do not adapt well to that change. Yes, so in general, I would say that it's the combat and the navigation of different levels, it's barely decent. But overall, what do I think of Anima Gate of Memories, and how does it compare with the tabletop role-playing game? There are many things that are perfect when it comes to taking that Anima RPG type of experience, and they transform it into the video game version. They convert it into an action RPG sort of experience. The theme, the world, it's pretty much perfect, spot on, despite some inconsistencies that I told you of different characters, and even some silly things, like I told you, Ergo constantly calling the the Bearer of Calamities baby, 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 but there's actually a reason as to why he calls her baby. By the end of the game, it will all make sense, because I thought, well, Ergo is always treating her in a very demeaning or slightly chauvinistic way, so why isn't he calling her something like sweet cheeks or honey buns, or, well, but maybe that's a bit too more tame, right? Light, or right, sorry, like more perhaps in a loving way, no? But Ergo uses some more feisty remarks. So you would say, why does he keep calling her baby? But there is actually a reason. I also like it that the different pocket dimensions, you really want to know more about each of those messengers, their tragedies, why they ended up becoming so monstrous and at the same time so powerful. I think you will also you're going to be feeling encouraged to think about the connections between Romeo Exet and the Bearer of Calamities and Ergo Mundus and Alienai and the Red Lady and Nameless, that is also going to be making his appearances. I really want to play the game that features Nameless as the main character, because I told you, despite his generic voice, because that voice actor, it's not that the voice actor is a bad voice actor, but I think his voice is more suited for an elf type of character in other RPGs. Nameless should be a bit more mysterious, perhaps with a bit of a gruff voice, not as gruff as like the snake voice, like Arcane, not like that, but a bit more serious. But his normal voice is kind of like, oh, I see that you have arrived. And he has like very weak voice in my opinion. mm, that voice definitely does not suit that character. I wish that the the voice actor for the nameless video game is different. I don't think it will be, but in general, when it comes to story, the world fits the tabletop RPG experience perfectly. Like I told you, you can take the story of the game and build a campaign around it. The gameplay, it's funny enough, it's when it comes to its frustrating aspects, it does share some things with the tabletop system, with that stun lock sort of mechanic, and the over-the-top spells. They do work like the um, tabletop RPG. Maybe you won't be able to destroy entire cities with your spells, but you still eliminate many enemies at the same time. Only the bosses, but it makes sense that the enemy bosses are almost at your same level. With them, you will have a difficult time even when using your most powerful spells. In fact, I prefer to use my normal combos with your basic attacks with the enemy bosses, because you never know what they are going to interrupt you with their attacks. So with those basic moves, you can strike 2 or 3 times and then you dodge. But if you do like the spell that I told you, that you create a sort of like a supernova or Ergo's barrage of claws, a lot of times it doesn't work. I think that's also a negative thing of the game. You level up too fast, in my opinion. You get to the most powerful attack too early in the game, in my opinion. And when you actually use it, you expected something a bit more powerful, or maybe I expected there to be an even more powerful or devastating attack later on in the game. Perhaps one that you would only use in the last level. So the leveling up, it doesn't feel that powerful when you consider that you level up too fast when compared to the progression of the story. But if you're looking for an action RPG with some annoying platforming elements, I would recommend that you get Anima Gate of Memories, just for the story, for the music, and for those cool moments, like I told you, that you really feel like you are so powerful, just like the characters that you would create in the tabletop RPG. I would definitely recommend that you get Anima Gate of Memories. The story is actually, it has some touching moments, and like I told you, it always feels like a very decadent, perhaps even melancholic world. The bearer of calamities needs to stop this apocalypse, but what is her reason for doing that? She's basically almost like a pariah because of her condition as the bearer of calamities. She doesn't know who she was. She doesn't remember her friends or family. Her boss, Romeo Exit, is pretty much a jackass. He's a jerk. And all of the characters that you meet, they all feel like they are doing their own stuff. And when it comes to Ergo Mundus, he also feels quite evil. At least during certain key moments in the story, you always feel like you're really carrying a calamity around with you. You do not know what Ergo's intentions are, and just that's part of the charm of the game. Sometimes you feel like maybe Ergo is warming up to you, and in a good way, not in the sense that Ergo that wants to get all touchy-feely with the main heroine. And other times he displays that he still has that tyrant within him, that he wants to take over everything, destroy everything, almost just on a whim. And so, considering all those things, I would recommend Anima Gate of Memories. Well, thanks for watching this review, and like I told you, I'm going to see if I can hurry up and bring out my next RPG review next week, because it's quite long. I don't think it will be as long as my review of Fight 2nd Edition. That one took like 2 hours and 40 minutes, more or less. But it's going to be a bit longish. So definitely watch it, and thanks so much again for watching my videos and watching this review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been sending Right Through RPG gift certificates to support the channel. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.